Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about the top 5 camel civilizations in Age of Empires 2. Last week I talked about the top 5 best paladin civs, and so this time it only felt natural to bring out the top 5 camel civs to maintain the harmony that we see in the stable, camels of course being a natural counter to the paladin. So with all that said, let's go ahead and talk about number 5, which is going to be the Malians. Now, the Malian camels aren't anything too special for the early game. However, in the late game, they've got a tech called Farimba, their golden crown, which gives all their cavalry plus 5 attack. Now, this is a very well-rounded tech as it affects cavalier, light cav, and camels. However, I would argue that it's best suited for the camel because it puts the camel to a 7+7 attack, which makes the camel an overall decent unit at fighting pretty much everything and also specializing against cavalry. Putting the camel at 14 attack compared to a regular 7+4, so 11 attack heavy camel gives you a +3 attack edge compared to a standard heavy camel from a generic civilization. Now, this bonus isn't the craziest camel bonus out there, so it's only snagging number 5, but I think Farimba camels perform very strongly and definitely worth mentioning on this list. Moving on to number 4, we've got a civilization with perfectly generic camels. However, they get a very hefty discount on them, making their camel play incredibly smooth. This civilization is the Berbers. Now, the Berbers, like the Malians, are not necessarily a camel-based civ, at least out of the stable. Of course, they do have a camel-based unique unit, the Camel Archer, which is an incredibly strong unit, especially in the late game. Might be like one of the best late game powerhouse units in the entire game. But the camel that comes out of the stable is very strong as well. They have generic, fully upgraded heavy camel at a 15% discount in Castle Age and a 20% discount in Imperial Age. Now, having discounts on camels lets you get them out earlier onto the game, lets you put more of them on the field, and also lets you trade cost effectively in the late game. Berbers also have their unique tech, Maghribi Camel, that lets their camel units regenerate over time. Now, it's not the craziest regeneration ever, but this nice little boost on top of having a discount on camels makes Berber camels definitely a force to reckon with in the late game. Overall, I think Berbers lean on their camels quite a lot from like the early Castle Age all the way into the late game. They are definitely a very solid camel civ, and especially if you count the Camel Archer as part of this discussion, the Berbers are an excellent camel civ and definitely earn a number 4 spot on the list. Moving on to number 3, we've got a civilization that in my opinion could easily be number 2 as well. It's honestly received a crazy buff lately, and it is a really strong camel civilization. Practically speaking, these camels are incredible, and that is the Saracens. The Saracens not having to pay anything for their extra HP before it was locked behind a unique tech, now they just get it for free, makes their camels so insane just from the start of the game in Castle Age and even all the way up into the Imperial Age with heavy camel. They have 145 HP camels in Castle Age, obviously 125 HP before Bloodlines, which is just such a crazy boost. This makes their camels incredibly tanky in Castle Age and also gives you really strong tempo advantage because you don't have to pay anything. This extra HP is not locked behind a unique tech, so the camels can come out right out of the gate and be strong right away. It's also worth mentioning that as they scale into the late game, their heavy camels have 170 HP plus 30 HP compared to a generic heavy camel, making them incredibly tanky and a formidable frontline unit. It's also worth mentioning that the Saracens have their unique unit, the Mameluke, which is also considered somewhat of a camel unit itself. It works pretty differently compared to the camel out of the stable, but it's definitely worth mentioning that the Mameluke is incredibly solid late game powerhouse. You don't see too much of it in a 1v1 game, for example, just because it's heavy on gold, but in team games, especially in the late game, especially on the closed maps like Arena and Black Forest, Mamelukes coming out are incredibly solid and makes Saracens an easy top 3 camel civ. Moving on to number 2, we've got somewhat of a predictable one as this civilization is entirely based around camels. In fact, they even start the game with a camel. It's the Gurjaras. Now, the Gurjaras are a really strong civ, and honestly, putting the Gurjaras here kind of gives away what number 1 is, but it's definitely an interesting comparison between number 1 and number 2 being the Gurjaras, and we'll talk about that later on the video. But the Gurjaras start the game right away with a camel scout. This really lets them set the tempo as a camel civilization. In Feudal Age, this camel scout will actually be a nice counter against scouts from the enemy, and if your opponent goes scouts extensively in the Feudal Age, you can actually mix in more camel scouts in Feudal Age from the stable. Even if you don't want to fight with camel scouts in Feudal Age but you want camels in Castle Age, on the way up to Castle Age you can make like 2 to 4 camel scouts and you can have those turn to camels right away in Castle Age. So the Gurjaras have a really underrated bonus that not a lot of people utilize, and that is getting the camel number out early because you're making them from Feudal Age. This lets you snowball early camel fights, early camel versus cavalier fights right, and makes Gurjaras an excellent civilization at tackling any kind of cavalry play, because if you're able to get a few camels out on the field before your opponent has a single knight, then by the time they get to cast stage, they already have to catch up to your numbers, and you can already move on to the next step, which could be adding in some monks or adding in some economy. That's not the only things that Gurjaras get as far as camels go though. The Gurjaras have a really nice bonus that makes their camels do extra bonus damage. So the camel already naturally has bonus damage against cavalry. For the Gurjaras, this is boosted by a pretty significant margin. This makes it so dealing with cavalry in the mid game is a very easy task for the Gurjaras. As if that wasn't enough though, they get yet another bonus geared towards their camels. Their unique tech in Imperial Age, the Golden Crown, gives their camels +5 armor. And on top of that, their Silver Crown makes all food units cheaper. So in the late game, you have a cheaper camel in terms of food cost that has +5 extra armor, melee armor that is, and also has extra bonus damage. That is such a crazy mix of bonuses that just all tie together so nicely to create this perfect late game camel that destroys pretty much everything that is mounted. The Gurjaras are lacking Blast Furnace, it is worth mentioning, so while their camels are incredibly strong in their own right because of all the crazy bonuses they get, they are on paper somewhat weaker than a generic camel against something that's not a mounted unit and that is a ranged unit, so you don't benefit from the melee armor. But that's such a unique situation that you probably won't be using camels in anyway that it's not really worth considering. In my opinion, Gurjaras are a solid top 2 camel civ with some of the best camels in the late game that are honestly incredibly hard to deal with. Before I show you guys number 1, I want to talk about an honorable mention that is insane. It could actually be in some scenarios the best camel civ, but because it's not exactly an overall really strong camel, especially in the late game, I felt a bit weird as to where to place the civ. The civ I'm talking about is the Byzantines. The Byzantines get an incredible 25% discount on camels from the start of the game. You don't have to pay for it, making the Byzantine camel spam incredibly strong straight out the gate. It's really hard to quantify this bonus precisely because if you think about it, the Byzantine camel in the late game is quite weak. It's lacking Blast Furnace and it's also lacking Bloodlines. It has no other unique tech geared towards it, and so the Byzantine camel falls off quite rapidly going into the late game. That being said, in Castle Age, Byzantine have probably some of the best camels just because of how cheap and easy to spam they are. Overall, I think it's well deserving of an honorable mention. It could be easily the best camel civ in a specific scenario in early Castle Age, and it could also be lower on this list because, you know, maybe in the late game, the Byzantine camel just doesn't quite compete. Moving on to number 1, this is in my opinion the embodiment of a camel civilization. This entire civ's identity revolves around a camel civ, and to be fair to it, it's actually a good civ even if we ignore the camel, but the camel is the center of the civilization, that is the Hindustani. As it turns out, the faster attacking camel from the Hindustani is better than a Gurjara camel in the Castle Age, and they also on top of that get the Imperial camel, which is probably one of the most busted cavalry units in the game, or mobile units in the game. Imperial camel just has incredible stats all around, and the economy from the Hindustani just lets you get to the Imperial camel very efficiently. You can mass them up nicely early and then just go ahead and pick up your techs later on, and you'll be having a very good time playing camels with the Hindustani. What I really like about the civ as well is that because you have the threat of insane camels, oftentimes your opponents will just respect that a lot and, you know, just play towards something else. And so most of the time you don't even have to use camels with Hindustani, but if you need to, they are there, and in my opinion they are clearly the best in the game. It is close with Gurjara. You could make some arguments there as far as late game Gurjara's camel having extra, you know, armor, being cheaper, but Hindustani, because they get Blast Furnace, ends up being the best camel in the game. The Imperial camel upgrade gives too many stats, and it's also not too hard to get to because it's not the most expensive upgrade in the game, and it also comes in rather quickly. In fact, the heavy camel upgrade takes even longer than the Imperial camel to kick in, which is an interesting note to take away from this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys did enjoy this one. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe if you guys did. And make sure to check me out on Twitch if you want to catch some of my live streams, and on Patreon if you want more exclusive content, especially for guides. If you want to get better at the game, Patreon is the place to do it. Links to both Twitch and Patreon in the description. Thanks for watching the video. Like, comment, subscribe. See you guys next time. Peace.